let's get started, and then if some other people come in, we can just catch them up. Thank you all for joining us today. And this has been a long time dream of mine to have Alex join us and talk to us about More Light Presbyterians. I had the great, exciting pleasure to join the More Light Presbyterians ambassadorship, which the first one started in 2019. And when I first saw the notice, I was like, oh, I'm not good enough to do that. And then I applied for a United Way leadership, very similar thing. And I got in, and that same day I was like, oh, well, if I could get into that, maybe I could do this whole Presbyterian thing. So I learned so much. And there's still, people are still updating me and teaching me things. And I just wanted to share some of that excitement and knowledge, especially from Alex, with you all. So I'm not going to read his resume or anything. I'll let him tell his own story. So without further ado, the executive director of More Light Presbyterians, Alex McNeill. And we also have Lori Tiberi is Downtown United Presbyterian Church's interim minister, and she's going to moderate. Take it away, Alex.
Lori, anything you want to add to kick us off, or are you good?
No, not at all. We're just really pleased to have you. And I think Corey explained there was a memorial service at this exact time. And so otherwise there would have been more folk here, but we are recording it, so others will get to see it.
Great. Well, I'm excited to be with you all. For those who are with us right now, and then those who will watch later, hello. I've been a fan of this congregation for a long time, and it was one of the first congregations I heard about as I was coming into being executive director at More Light Presbyterians back in 2013. So I'll give a quick history of me, and then do some longer conversation about what's More Light, where have we been, where are we going, and what do we see are some of the needs of what it means to be a More Light in this era. So I am Alex, as you know, and I've been at More Light since 2013. So I just finished celebrating 8 years as of August, and it's been quite a span of 8 years in our movement for LGBTQ inclusion. But I've been part of the movement since long before that. I grew up Presbyterian, and my family moved around a bunch when I was a kid, but we always ended up at a First Presbyterian church at wherever town we lived, and didn't know there were other kinds of Presbyterian churches like downtown, or Second Presbyterian for an embarrassingly long time. But church for me was the constant in my life. We changed schools and towns and states, but church was the place that I could be fully myself all the time. I remember running around the fellowship hall after church during coffee hour, and going to Vacation Bible School. And when my parents joined First Presbyterian in Asheville, North Carolina, where they still live, and now where I live again. So I'm in Western North Carolina in the mountains. The church there had a youth group that sort of fizzled, and myself, my younger brother, and a good friend of mine who later went on to be a Presbyterian minister restarted the youth group, and we did all kinds of shenanigans like bell choir and youth Sunday. Like, church for me was home. And as a person who later understood myself to identify as transgender, I identify as a transgender man, which means for the first 25, 26 years of my life, I was seen as female and used female pronouns, and was raised female. And as a kid exploring gender, even though I didn't have any words for it, the church never questioned it. They just let me be myself and all of my fullness. And I realized as I was graduating high school that I felt called to ministry, and the church had been a home for me. I wanted to help it feel like a home for everybody, recognizing that, and this was in the late 90s, early 2000s, that in the South, the church wasn't really a great home for LGBTQ folks. And as someone who was starting to come to terms with my sexual orientation as a queer person, that we could do better and that the church could be more actively a home for LGBTQ folks. Thankfully, my home church was that home. And as I was coming out to my parents about both identifying as queer and wanting to go to seminary after college, those were two things that were wrapped up in the same coming out story. I'm not sure which shocked them more, my plans for grad school before I graduated high school, or that I already kind of knew and was ready to share about my sexual orientation at that age. Thankfully, they supported both, knowing that at the time, you all know this very well, that the Presbyterians had adopted G60106B, which meant that openly LGBTQ folks couldn't serve in ordained leadership. At 18, I had a transformative moment with one person that you're so familiar with, Reverend Janie Spar, who came to Asheville 2 weeks after I came out to my parents and the pastoral staff of my home church, First Pres. She came to Asheville and she led, a night at a church nearby, a Presbyterian church nearby, and the pastors told my parents about it, told me to go, and my mom and I went, and we watched Janie walk up and down the center aisle of that church, being the lesbian evangelist that she is, sharing the good news of God's love and affirmation. And she was the first person I ever met who made me feel like I could eventually serve in ministry. So your church has been part of my story, though I didn't know it at the time, how much you all were involved with her ministry, but she transformed my parents that night. They had been supportive, but didn't really understand kind of the depth of support that they could have. And my parents went on to being huge advocates here in Western North Carolina, and ran a group called Welcome Home for people who identified as LGBTQ and their family members. And were really, just yesterday, got a call from a pastor, could you talk to someone whose kid is coming out as trans? So that night was a pivotal moment in our life. And I count it as the reason I could go to college and eventually seminary with the sure knowledge that my parents and my church supported me, even when the denomination was still on the fence and actively didn't support openly LGBTQ folks from serving in ministry. And at 18, I was naive enough to say, we'll just change the law. The laws aren't helpful, we'll just change it. And I kind of felt, whatever sense it was, God with us, that even though mentors and people who supported me in my life were saying, I don't know when these laws are ever going to change. I hope it changes in your lifetime. But in 2001, it felt very far away that those laws would ever change. And so I graduated college in 2005 and then went straight to seminary at Harvard Divinity School because of their openness for LGBTQ folks, actually, and because of their interfaith work. And it was then that I really got to know some folks involved with More Light, and did my internship at a More Light Presbyterians church, Church of the Covenant in downtown Boston, and started to get to know the history of activism and organizing beyond Janie into changing these policies and laws. And I graduated from seminary in 2008, which was one of the first years that our national body our General Assembly had voted to remove G60106B, but then it had to go out into the presbyteries for that ratifying vote where a majority had to vote yes. And I learned that my home presbytery in Western North Carolina, where I was already under care for the ordination process, voted yes for the first time to change their vote to say we wanted to take change this policy. We want to support LGBTQ folks in ministry. But as you all know, it did pretty devastating. I mean, I thought that they're ever going to change its policies, and what is it going to take for that to happen? So in 2010, there was the next chance for not just for deleting G6006B, but replacing it with a passage that actually talked about what we look for in candidates for ministry. And I realized then that if I didn't get involved with helping to change this policy, I couldn't really call myself a Presbyterian anymore. I'd been under care at that point 7 years. And for me, it was really important that I help shift the needle and have conversations across the country with people who were going to be involved in the vote. And so that's how I first got involved with More Light in 2010. I got to be a super volunteer working to call pastors in different presbyteries across the country. More Light and Covenant Network were coordinating together a campaign to ratify this new law. And for me, that was a transformative moment of getting to have deep conversations with pastors, not about will you vote yes or no, but actually centered on our values. What do we care about in the Presbyterian Church? What do we understand to be the marks of a calling to ministry? And getting vulnerable and personal with each other about our own journeys and stories. And that experience convinced me, I had been on the cusp of, is it time for me to leave the denomination? Because it's not going to change. I know many of us have been on that cusp in different parts of our life. For me, that was mine. And having those conversations actually reaffirmed the goodness of this denomination and that people are willing to have deep conversations when invited. And it kept me in the ordination process at a moment when I thought about it all up. I'd graduated from seminary 2 years prior to that. And, a short expanse in the life of so many others who had been working towards this, but nonetheless, a crisis of faith. And so I recommitted and in 2013 to being Presbyterian and staying in the ordination process. And in 2013, got the call that More Light Presbyterians was searching for a new executive director. And would I consider applying? I had been volunteering in lots of different ways on other campaigns on LGBTQ issues, doing some writing and public speaking, et cetera. And I applied based on the Holy Spirit's nudge and realized that More Light was at a kind of transition point of its own. Having worked, since 1978, 1973, Presbyterian Gay and Lesbian Caucus and More Light Churches Network, becoming More Light Presbyterians in the 90s, had been working on changing laws and policies and working with congregations around what does it mean to be inclusive? How do we live that out? Nurturing individuals who are LGBTQ. And we were at this moment in 2013, if you recall, was 2 years after the laws had gone into place in the Book of Order in 2011 that changed the policies for LGBTQ folks to be in ministry, but before the denomination had changed anything around marriage equality. It was still, Janie still being brought up on charges for marrying same-sex couples up until very recently to that point in 2012, as were others. And there was this moment of, okay, if we can move towards marriage equality and changing the standards for marriage, then what? What are we going to do? We've worked so hard to get out the bad policies. Who are we going to be if we actually start to achieve the kind of denomination that we know God's been calling us towards? So that was an exciting moment for me. And in particular, as a transgender person who had come out as trans 3 or 4 years prior to 2013. So I guess 2011 for me, knowing that the church and that even More Light was just starting to do more work around transgender inclusion, knowing that the country at that point hadn't done much conversation about transgender folks, there was an excitement about joining More Light, but also a bit of trepidation around, were people going to be afraid of a transgender person in leadership? I mean, there was a lot of negative and harmful messages around trans folks still circulating. Would people be interested in and want to learn about gender identity alongside sexual orientation? And what I found really making the decision to be open open about being trans and having had that journey and still on that journey, is that actually it invited many more churches and people to share with me their desire to learn and grow and know more. And so it's been this moment, this journey since I've been with More Light since 2013, having changed policies to change towards marriage equality. And then in 2018, we're able to pass inclusive policies that were proactively supportive of LGBTQ folks for the very first time, giving the denominational offices the ability to advocate for trans people, the ability to celebrate and affirm the gifts LGBTQ folks have brought and can continue to bring to ministry. We were also at a pivotal moment around, who do we say that we are? What is the work we're called to do? And I had another one of those transformative moments I want to share with you that really impacted how I saw our calling at More Light. So early in my days at More Light, pre-pandemic, if you can imagine, I used to get to travel to a bunch of More Light churches and churches that were discerning, becoming inclusive. It was a large part of my role. And now I get to do that virtually. But back then it was in person. And at More Light churches, often people would tell me their journey, tell me the story of their journey of being More Light. And I remember a couple of those conversations that followed this same line of thinking. So I remember one church that had been More Light for a number of decades. An older gentleman takes me aside after church and starts to tell me the story of their being More Light. And he says it like this: well, first we welcomed gay people, and then lesbians, and then we learned about bisexual people, and now transgender people. Up in the air and said, what's next? He wasn't being mean. He was really trying to show me that if we're always looking out for an identity we don't know yet, it might lead to this kind of exasperated frustration, like, what don't I know? What am I not yet seeing as a church that's trying to be intentionally inclusive? And in that moment, I realized, the history of our decades-long work for LGBT inclusion was really formative, and it was revolutionary in the past decades of, as we're learning about new identities, we're starting to name them out loud for the first time. We're going from homosexual to gay to lesbian to bisexual to transgender to intersex to asexual, non-binary, like expanding the language of our identities is very important work. And naming ourselves is very important. And one thing that I realized is that if the way we understand welcome is about bringing in one identity at a time into this banner, an umbrella of who God includes, that welcome can start to be a series of ors, gay or straight, bisexual or transgender. It's like a list, a comma list. And not the fullness of the multiplicity of identities that we're bringing in, and that fullness of we'll never truly know someone's full identity. And I had this recognition that the way we were talking about welcome might have run its course. It could lead to this sense of exasperation and frustration from some folks. So I was like, what do we need to be refocusing on? And I had this epiphany watching this show called The Cosmos with Neil deGrasse Tyson. It's a remake of the original Cosmos about the nature of the universe. So it's a mini series. They talk about space and the universe, and it's very nerdy and scientific. But I was watching the first episode, so I wasn't quite lost yet in the good science, but watching the first episode. And they start to talk about how big our universe is. They start us on Earth, zoom out into our solar system, zoom out to our galaxy, zoom out to galaxies beyond our galaxy, and then zoom out even further and say, even with all of this vastness, the universe is still expanding. In that moment, seeing it on my TV, for whatever reason, that visual really impacted me. And I realized, if we say that God is part of the creation of the universe, that God is part of the bigness of the universe, our God is still expanding. God is getting even bigger than we can even see with the observable eye, with the best telescope. God is still expanding. What does that mean about us if we're creatures of God? And the way I started to understand this is to say that we believe, what if we believe in a God of abundance, of a God of infinite possibilities and expansion? Are we not also creatures of abundance? Might we also be creatures of infinite possibility and expanding? And then from that belief, how are we called to show up? What's our posture? What's our action in reaction to that understanding of God? And I don't know if you've ever been camping. I've been camping sometimes when you're in a beautiful spot and you look up at the night sky and you can just see like the vastness of the stars that just seem to go, from one side of the planet to the other. And I know sometimes when you're looking at that huge, vast sky, sometimes you kind of want to go back in your tent and like zip it up and say, okay, like it's too big, God, I don't want to see all that. It's too much. It's a little dizzying. And I know a lot of people in the face of abundance who want to hide in their tent because it's too much. It's too scary. There's too much unknown. But the posture that I believe, and we've been working at More Light to really embrace, is a recognition of a God of abundance, and that our posture is one of awe and wonder at how big God is, and also how big and multiple we are, that we are always more than just one identity. I'm white and transgender and queer and Southern, that we believe in abundance of in the fullness of and that part of our role is to help bring this understanding of God as part of what it means to be more light. I mean, more light in its definition is based on a sermon that was preached in 1978 when the United Presbyterian Church adopted a minority report that said that homosexuals, the term they used, could not serve in leadership in the denomination. And the pastor who'd been part of the task force that made the alternate recommendation that gay people should be able to be involved at all levels of the church, went back to his home church, West Park Presbyterian in New York City, and preached a sermon that named that there is yet more light to break forth on the scriptures around homosexuality, and that they weren't going to discriminate in leadership because they were following the Holy Spirit. To me, the Holy Spirit has always been about this abundance of and what do we not know yet? And let's greet this unknowing with awe and wonder, not with fear of the vastness of the night sky. So I share that depth with you because it has really influenced who we are at More Light and how we see our work. That we recognize being LGBTQ was never about, being a solo identity, that we can center LGBTQ folks in our work and recognize the other places and identities and impacts that LGBTQ folks face by their race, their class, their gender, their location, their immigration status or refugee or asylum status. And that part of what the call to our More Light churches is to take this deep sense of God's love for LGBTQ folks in its specificity, the way in which we've named that, shared that in sanctuaries, in all our ministries, and then bring that lens into the other places where we're called to work. What I love about More Light churches is that y'all are everywhere doing all kinds of amazing social justice work. I've just been so amazed that the depth and the innovation towards justice that I see our More Light churches doing. And what I noticed early on was that I'd visit More Light churches and maybe they'd have an amazing welcoming statement. Maybe it'd be a really inclusive community, like internally for LGBTQ folks. And then they would also be doing incredible ministries of justice with experiencing homelessness or on immigration, for example, but not realizing that there's a connection point, that the two are connected, that there's, people who are experiencing homelessness, a huge portion of the LGBTQ population experiences homelessness. And, if we're working with refugees and asylum seekers, well, some of the most under-resourced refugees and asylum seekers are LGBTQ folks because they don't have families that they can join when they're coming to the US, or support systems of their kind of like country of origin that they can embed within, because they're fleeing their country because they're LGBTQ. And so our churches have a way to step up that is maybe different than another one down the street who doesn't have a lens for LGBTQ folks. So all of our programs and resources have been developed in the past few years to really equip congregations for the ministries that they're called to do in the world. That in earlier years, when we were trying to change policies and bring greater inclusion to the denomination, it was really about, here's the way we're going to tackle this year. We're going to focus on this overture, on this piece of policy. Like, let's all rally around that. In recent years, it's been more of, how can we partner with each church to discern their unique call in the world for how they live out their More Light identity. For some churches, that's partnering with local campuses, and so working with college students. For other churches, that was the church I was with this morning, virtually in Florida, that they have a campus that they want to partner with around LGBTQ inclusion. For other churches, they're really involved in ministries with the homeless, and they want to look at, how can we support LGBTQ folks experiencing homelessness? I think churches that are passionate about racial justice and anti-racism have a really powerful way to see the ways in which gender, sexual orientation, and race, those oppressions come from a single root of white supremacy and racial bias. And how do we actually untangle some of those threads of white supremacist culture that impacts, in particular, folks who are LGBTQ and people of color. So our resources that we developed, we have webinars, trainings, teach-ins that we call them, that have a number of different kinds of points of education. That what we realized is, I can't be everywhere at once. Shocking, I know, but really helping churches get the kind of training, education, and workshops that they request from us most frequently as soon as they want, and in a high quality video format. In COVID, a lot of our work has been very digital. So we started this thing called Virtual Pulpit Supply, where we partner with different preachers across the More Light universe, so to speak, to bring diverse voices to different pulpits across the country. So giving pastors a break, first of all. Secondly, bringing in new voices to worship. And I'm really excited that through that program, we've worked with over 150 churches. Over 150 churches in the past year and some change have gotten to hear from an LGBTQ or allied preacher in a way that they would not have gotten to hear for that person. Maybe they live too far away. And it's been exciting. I don't think I've visited 150 churches in 8 years. I mean, I hope I have, but I don't know. That's a lot of travel. So it's been a pretty incredible way to share more light in more places. And then the last thing I'll say that I always want to make sure I speak to is part of the ministry that we've realized that we're called to do is to help people shine more light visibly and tangibly in their communities. And one of the ways that we support churches to do that is through things like buttons, stickers, like ways to shine more light visibly. And I have to say, I didn't know the power of a humble button until the past few years when, people wearing these buttons, the stories that I've heard back because of these buttons are pretty incredible. I was at a college conference that Montreat here in North Carolina puts on every year, and we brought some of our pronoun buttons, and we have different pride flag buttons that represent different identities. and a college student whose dad was actually the pastor of that group picks up one of our non-binary buttons, and I don't think I have it on me here, and takes it back and wears it back to their group that night, and a different pronoun as well. And without saying a word, just like proudly wearing their buttons. And the group got it immediately, started they clapped and cheered and hugged this person with consent. And we're so excited about this person coming out in their midst. And it was amazing to me just that a single button could help that person have a really powerful experience with their group. And so I think that we help churches bring more light at Pride, at different events, and in their own sanctuary, so that people can see right away this church loves and supports and cares about me, and I can shine more light on my shirt all day long. And it's I don't know, it's been a really powerful part of our ministry. So I've talked at you a bit. I'm going to pause and see if Lori up to further.
I am experiencing freezing on my end. Are you guys experiencing me freezing? Me or Alex? Me.
It might be
Alex
me.
is freezing once in a while. You're
Yeah.
good.
Okay. Am I good? Okay.
Do you call in? I can try and call in and see if that helps it.
No, I think you're fine. It was just a momentary thing. I think you're good. Yeah. Yeah, Alex, I just want to say I can affirm the symbols thing. I just finished 16 years as the chaplain at the University of Rochester for the students. And one of my things that I would do with them is help them figure out how to find churches when they graduate. You know, like what's the lingo? What are the little terms to avoid or to look for? And one of the things they would often talk about is, like, even the Presbyterians often didn't know what more light meant. And certainly among different denominations, nobody knows each other's lingo for queer affirming. And, you know, I said, you know, go home to your churches and tell them to put up flags, because that people will register. So yes, on the symbols.
Yeah, it matters greatly. And what I share with churches who haven't taken the step to have some sort of symbol is that it's powerful for the folks who are already in your sanctuary, but it's more powerful for those who don't know are looking. You will start to hear stories from people who have found your symbols and will appreciate it, you know, with their whole being. It's a life-saving action, actually. It
is, absolutely. I know that Marie had some questions. So Marie, do you want to throw one of them out there?
All right, Marie, let's hear it.
Well, nice to see you, Alex.
Nice to see you.
Last time we were together was a few years back when Ray brought a group down to Still Point, or
yeah, was that at Stony Point?
Yeah, Stony Point. That's right. Stony Point.
Yeah, that's been a while.
Yep, keeping track of you. You're doing good work. I sent my questions to Corey. And Corey, I'm at a different computer, not my.
Oh, I can read them.
Yeah, that would be good. Thanks. I mean, they weren't that complicated, but.
Well, and Marie's questions were kind of my questions too. Great. The first one, there's like 3 parts in this in these questions. This question: what is the responsibility of the church today in addressing the needs of our LGBTQ community? Are there still needs? What are they? And my addendum to that is like, it, you know, back in the 1990s, it was a big deal just to say we want Janie. But today we need a little more. People want to hear a little more. We only recently is like last May, I think it was, April or May, we put up our Black Lives Matter flag and our Pride flag. And for such a big cause, to not have those before was kind of sad. But well, let me read it again. What is the responsibility of the church today in addressing the needs of our LGBTQ community?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Thank you, Marie and Corey.
Why I ask that, Alex, is that quite frequently people will say, well, there's nothing more that you need, right? You've got your rights. You can get married. You can do blah, 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 whatever. But, it's like anybody who's struggling and they say you've got your rights until you try to do something.
Yeah.
And then suddenly there's all these barriers.
That's right.
So that's sort of the crux of that question.
Yeah.
What does the church need to continue or to start doing again or change?
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. And yeah, I hear that question a lot too. From the place of it's all solved and fixed, right? No.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
I think that I want to acknowledge there have been great strides within the denomination and in our country towards further rights and recognition of LGBTQ folks. But looking around, even in the past year, there has been a huge pushback legislatively, nationally, around transgender inclusion. And I think that is the battleground that the country is in right now. I think marriage equality with the Supreme Court justices was in some question. But what we know is that the number of legislative attacks on transgender participation in life, from sports to medical care to access of housing and economic security and all the factors that impact life, has been on the rise. And 2020 saw the most number of bills across the country that were proposed in different legislatures, from states that you would expect, like Tennessee, to states that you wouldn't. And so there's been this huge increase in that. And so what I've asked our churches to do is to really do that deep work of educating ourselves around transgender experience, building our depth of knowledge so that we're people who can talk to our neighbors, potentially be a standout voice for trans inclusion. But then also there's a lot of places where our advocacy is actually needed. Our standing up to say, my faith compels me to support non-discrimination. And right now we actually have a chance towards a federal non-discrimination bill that includes LGBTQ folks, gender identity and sexual orientation, called the Equality Act. And that's been a huge legislative push for churches that like the legislative piece, where we've needed some advocacy from people of faith. I've been on 2 different calls with my state senators who are not progressive here in North Carolina to bring a faith perspective on the need for non-discrimination protections. I think our churches have a huge ask. I think there's an ask for us to be stepping forward, because we know that the more conservative side of that line is active and beating the band, and we really need our churches to be more public in our commitments towards non-discrimination. And I think that each community is in its own place of reckoning with where is the gap between commitments towards inclusion and the lived experience of people trying to access it. Some towns and communities, again, it's a population of LGBTQ folks experiencing homelessness that doesn't have a shelter, that doesn't have good foster care, that doesn't have some of those support systems that folks need to get back on their feet or leave an abusive situation. And I've seen a lot of churches really get involved in that dimension. I think that there's, looking at, churches in communities where there's a large immigrant population. There's folks who immigrate to the US because of their sexual orientation and gender identity, and where are the places of support for folks who are navigating a new identity or being able to be out and can't really kind of be as aligned with the community that they grew up in. So I ask our churches to look around and think, where are some of the needs? What is not here? And one of the ways to access that is really having conversations with LGBT groups in the area, with folks within the church, kind of doing a needs assessment, like what are some of our needs? And I think that the leading edge that all churches can really be about is what I was talking about at the very end earlier of, I think we have some work to do to continue to detangle some of the like norms and normativity around identities and like binaries. I think we're in a moment of starting to undo some of the rigidity of binaries that leads to liberation for all of us. In our in trainings around gender identity and sexual orientation, we invite people to think about, each of us has a sexual orientation and a gender identity. And we're all trying to navigate that in an environment that, whether due to our religion, our culture, our social or economic status, our geography, has some pretty normative assumptions about you, what you should and should not do based on your gender identity or sexual orientation. So particularly when people raised as women understand that deeply, especially across their lifetime. Men as well have a huge pressure of what society says you should or should not do as men. And I think our church is starting to like really grapple with that. It's pretty radical because if God is big and expansive, how can we start to give ourselves more freedom and room to explore where have the limitations been put externally that actually are not God ordained? That if, you know, we believe in a non-patriarchal God. So what does that mean for the way that we live together and how we understand our identities? And that's some deep internal work, and we have some resources to support that. But I think it can lead to some real transformation of how we understand our life together and our calling in the world.
Is it okay if I share something real quick? I just wanted to share that I went to, I don't know how long ago it was, but not too long, a hematologist appointment who absolutely refused to address me with the right pronouns. And, you know, we're in a city that is very high population of LGBTQ and especially trans people. You know, so that it's there's still so much. It's really hard. And to be misgendered, and it's hard, like I grew up here, so a lot of people knew me before, and then to get people just to use the right pronouns, or well, and I use this example too. My ex and I used to call my mom dude, which she hated because she's like, I'm a lady, I'm a woman, and but that is a great example of how it feels. Like, she didn't like it. Well, I don't like it I don't like to be called she. The other thing I wanted to quickly share about the pins is I went and found, I have my That All May Freely Serve necklace. The choir wore these, and I stole my mother's when I was probably in my early 20s. I didn't have the vocabulary or knowledge of anything besides being gay or lesbian. I didn't know. I knew how I felt, but so this to me was a huge symbol. And I have it hanging on my wall that I look at every day.
Yeah, Corey, I really appreciate you sharing that. I think it, from the doctor's office, shows, you can have a state and a city and a county that has done everything it can to ensure inclusion, and the rubber is going to hit the road. I mean, what a vulnerable place. Like being the doctor could not be more vulnerable. I know from personal experience. And there's a gap, and not every medical professionals are still not yet trained across the board around respecting gender identities and transition. And then I think like your story about the necklace that you saw from your mom. I hear in that too, I think there's a really powerful need for storytelling, for sharing intergenerationally about our experiences as LGBTQ folks or as allies. I think for those who, have been in this for decades, sometimes there is an experience that, youth today have it so much easier. And sometimes they do, but often they don't. Like we're all fighting our own battles. We're all working, coming out is still, I think, it can be a scary act. And to build some of those relationships and curiosity about what was life like for you? What is it like now? Where are some of those stories? I think we're in a moment of really, we've had now several generations that have been able to be out, which is amazing. And so what are some of those stories and experiences that are the same and that are different, and learning from each other is a huge invitation for a church, to me, like downtown, that has been active and vocal for so long, to be able to hold together some of that history with the present and potentially the future.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Corey.
Hello,
Hi, Dale.
can I talk?
Please.
Well, I have to leave because I have something at 4, but thank you, Alex, very much. I appreciate it. And Corey, who I've not ever known real well, but I'll get to know you now that you're on session. One of the things I wanted to just add is I have a friend, I live at the Gables, and I have a friend here who is transgender. We eat together every day. And I have no difficulty using she, the female gender, with her. It is difficult with, say, someone like Corey. You do forget because you have 2 pictures, and you have to be careful, or I have to be careful on the gender issue. I don't understand they at all. Maybe you can, before I leave, you could explain the they to me. Okay?
Yeah.
But I do want to say that my friend here, I have no problem. She is a she, and that's the only way I've known her.
Yeah. Well,
Corey, can you explain to me the they?
Corey, I'm happy to take a first
If it
pass at it. Yeah, thank you, Dale. And I'm glad that you're able to be there for your friend who's trans at the Gable. That's really important.
Alex, can you explain they to me?
I'm working towards it. So we actually have a video on our site about pronouns. So it's about 16 minutes. You could watch it, but they and them is, as you know, most of us were taught to use it in for plural, third person plural. And it has been used in more than recent years. We use they all the time, actually, in literature, in our speech, when we don't know the gender identity of the person of whom we're speaking. So there's, I could point you to examples. There's a line in Harry Potter that I found where they're like, Harry knew somebody was there, Why didn't they speak to him? Right? So singular subject, plural pronoun. So we do it all the time. Now, it's been a they and them has been adopted by people who identify as non-binary, because we know non-binary is about the expansiveness of gender, about not needing to go with either or, male or female, either being neither or a combination of both. A non-binary person could tell you how they want to identify in that. But they and them is a recognizable pronoun. So it's not a brand new kind of word that folks have used to be able to hold space for the bigness of that identity, that it's more than just two, than just he, him, or she and her. I personally love they and them because one of the things that I recognize in it is that it holds space for even the journey that someone's been on. That there is two of us. There are more like for me in my lifetime, I feel like I've been 5 different gender identities over the course of my life, right? I used to say of shirts that I didn't like anymore. That was 2 genders ago. I got to throw that out. I'm a whole different person now. But all of us are evolving how we want to represent ourselves in the world and how we want to be seen, either in a static identity as woman or male. But I think non-binary folks are really claiming space for, I'm on a journey. My identity is bigger than he and she, and they and them suits that identity to be able to claim space for that bigness. And I'm often asked to teach about pronouns as if I'm an English teacher. But my definition of what pronouns are is that a pronoun is a placeholder for personhood. That we use pronouns to represent that I know that you're a person. That Marie's a person, Marilyn's a person, Corey's a person, Dale's a person. And I use their pronouns when I'm not saying their name, because I'm not to represent, I'm not talking about an object, not an it. And so they and them, I think, is a really wonderful pronoun that we can use to respect people's personhood. And so it does take practice. I think sometimes it can feel like learning a new language. And if you've ever learned a new language that wasn't your native one, it took writing down sentences with they and them in it. It takes practicing it out loud on your own in your mirror with a friend. And so we can get tripped up and use the wrong pronoun. I respect that you had to, that you named that, Dale. But when we do get tripped up, it's always important to, if we catch ourselves or someone corrects us in the moment, to say, oh, I'm sorry, and then correct pronoun and move on. Because again, it's less about getting it right 100% of the time and more about saying, I respect your personhood because I want to use the right pronoun for you that you have told me you want me to use.
Well, thank you. And good luck and goodbye. I have to be someplace at 4 o'clock. Okay.
All right. Thank you, Dale. Hope that was helpful.
Thank you, Dale.
Bye, Dale.
I wish I had a chalkboard.
Are
I
there
have
other? Yeah. Go on,
just
Corey.
I would like to talk about so our church is across from City Hall, and we've had a lot of Black Lives Matter movement. Like how and I know that it's important within this intersection because my understanding partly came, I will never understand what it's like to be anything but white, except to, try my best. It's such a huge topic. I'm not sure what exactly to ask, but how can we best support that intersection?
Yeah. I think that's a great question, and it is a big one. I think there's a couple of ways. One, showing up. I think just showing up, walking alongside, not centering ourselves as white folks in the work that all of us who are working on anti-racism are learning to do. I think our lessons that we've learned as LGBTQ affirming churches, particularly for those churches like Downtown, who did that work long before it was cool, long before it was popular, long before it was actually sanctioned within the denomination. We know what it's like to need to stand up for something that's still gaining traction, that's not maybe the most popular thing to do, standing up in our convictions with people leading the way. So, you know, downtown made the action to have Janie be an evangelist when you realized that it was going to be impossible to ordain her to that role. And I think what it took to do that was centering Janie's experience and learning from her, letting her lead the way, literally letting her lead the way in the work as a marginalized person who'd been impacted by this. So, and we know what it's like to try and reframe and recenter the folks who are experiencing the oppression we're working against in the conversation and in the action and in the work that we do. I think that there's a lot of lessons around how to build a congregation from maybe zero interest in LGBTQ issues to being an inclusive church that we can bring into, okay, what does it take to help values like anti-racism and work for racial justice feel like a full community supports it? This is not just the action of one committee, one pastor, one person. This is a full church commitment, that it really takes walking this journey of helping to bring folks along about why it's important for this church to take these actions, why we do value anti-racism, that requires framing in our theology, that requires education to deepen our understanding, that requires taking action and reflection to like live that out in our commitments. So I think that there's things that we can bring from our journeys over the decades of being an LGBT inclusive church to bear into the work for Black Lives Matter and ending racist oppression. And that part of what it takes is investigating our theology, under like recognizing and reckoning with, where did we assume God was white? You know, where did we assume God was male? Where did we assume, because of the way we were being taught about it, that you know, Christianity was superior, right? That there's lots of detangling of some of the legacies of white supremacy on Christianity that will lead us into a greater vision of liberation within our religion. And I think that's a really powerful journey to take. And that, like I said earlier, it impacts not just race, but race and sexuality and gender. I think there's lots of ways in which particular harshness has been applied to folks stepping outside of the norms of the colonial white supremacist norms of race, gender, sexuality. So we see those kind of woven together. It can help us really feel. I love this, like church bells. Is those really church bells?
I don't know. I had I can't remember exactly the scripture number. I think it was Mark something. The one about the wealthy man who asked Jesus, you know, how can I get into heaven? And I've done all of these things, and he says, give away all your worldly goods. And I was thinking that the shock that the wealthy man must have felt, to me, is a little bit like that white fragility feeling that we can feel sometimes, like because, you know, we're very accepting anti-racial church, but we still have that, the working on the I'm losing my words today right now, but patriarchal system and stuff. And it's hard. but worthwhile, and like to sit in that discomfort and listening. I found a lot of learning has come from just listening to what you were saying, listening to people's stories.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think that listening to people's stories is that tapestry of education that just can't be woven any other way. That has a depth of layers to it that is far beyond the textbook. And being, I think the simple thing that it takes, like you just said, is putting ourselves in the room and listening, and not needing to be the one to talk, to receive, and to then take action from that place when invited to. So, getting comfortable with the unknown is a big part of it, that we don't need to know everything. Yeah. Oh, oh, great. Thank you, Nancy. Laurie, were you about to hop in?
I was not. No,
Okay.
I was just seeing the time and going to just ask if there's any last questions.
Oh, wow. I'll just read that quickly. As a preliminary FYI, I've heard that the current U of R Lattimore Health Practice Office will be changing its name to U of R Gender Wellness Obstetrics and Gynecology. That is pretty huge and pretty amazing. As I'm older, and I had a partial hysterectomy when I was 25 for medical reasons, but like when I was 25, like the idea that a trans man could give birth, I had no concept of that. And I kind of wish I had, it probably would have changed. It might have changed my life, but that's the past.
Yeah. I think we're very much evolving what is possible. And it has taken, like Downtown did so faithfully, people sharing what they see as possible to help us unlock to, whoa. For me, seeing Janie, suddenly it was possible for a queer person to be a minister. Seeing other trans people helped me believe it was possible to be a trans person in my fullness and in my understanding of that identity. And I think many people are continuing to expand the possibilities for our gender expressions and lived experiences. And I particularly honor youth in that, who are teaching us so much about kind of shedding some of the shoulds and the binaries and the limiting beliefs about how we can be in our bodies. And I think what it takes as a congregation called to inclusion is to continue listening to those new voices that are coming forward. I told the story with the man about what's next. I think we can be what's next. Like, we can embrace that uncertainty with excitement that God is sending us people to show us what's next. And our work is to keep showing up, to listen and embrace that next edge, and know that we will hear the specific call to our community as we do so.
Well, we're a little over, so I want to honor your time, and thank you to Lori too for moderating questions and joining us. I just wanted to really thank you. I missed what that said. Lattimore Women's Health Practice. Oh, the woman's part. Now it's gonna be gender. Okay. Anyway, thank you so much. Like, when I started transitioning was right about when things changed, and you were ordained, and I'm sure that everybody who couldn't join us today would have lots of other questions to ask you. And I could keep asking so many questions also, but just how meaningful the work that you're doing is to me and to so many people. And hopefully maybe we can have another conversation like this for level 2 or some other questions that people might come up with.
Yeah. Thank you, Corey. And thank you all. It's been an honor to get to be with you, even virtually. And I thank you all for the decades of faithful work and faithful listening and journeying with the Spirit where you're called to go, and to support leaders in your midst like Corey and others who have come before to really share their gifts. And I think that is a huge place of gratitude for the callings that we've had. I think it has allowed us to meet so many with God-given gifts and talents to help increase our ministry and God's work in the world. So I'm grateful for you all in that faithful discernment over the years.
Super.
Thank you to everyone for coming too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care. Thank you, Alex.
Thanks,
Have
y'all.
a great evening.
Bye.
Have a good
Okay.
Thank
afternoon.
you, Alex.
Bye-bye.
Presentation.